I'm going to divide my presentation into four main sections. Three of them, are related to the way I make my living. I'm going to talk about economic growth. The topics being covered by Mr. Javier are very important to share with you some figures and to share with you the perspectives for Colombia this year. Secondly, we have had a recent evolution in the Colombian external sector that has given rise to many debates, to many discussions. I would like to present the figures otherwise and to enrich the debate on our external sector and on the potential vulnerabilities that this sector of our economy has. Thirdly, the fiscal figures, to show you a different way of looking at fiscal figures and their recent evolution with an alternative way of presenting the results and their relationships with the midterm in order to conclude with two items that are taking place in the government regarding the dynamics of the insurance sector and the types of regulatory changes coming from two sources. And in that last part, I want to explain to you what am I referring to. Economic growth in Colombia has been characterized by a dynamic of rebounds. As of 2015, we had a very slow period in the economy, growing below what we need to grow at least to maintain constant unemployment rates. And at last, this is rebounding. We see an international comparison with respect to what happened during the second semester of this year. You see to the left those countries that in marginal terms during the second half of 2018, you see the annual growth rate of the different economies. We have an average growth of above 2% in Latin America. And this is an exercise that was conducted by The Economist journal. And Colombia, see that it is a country that has an annual growth of 5.6%. That could be compared to the rest of the region and to the other countries that are part of the exercise carried out by The Economist journalist. This is a growth process that if you take a look at the first semester of the year is quite generalized with the exception of a problem that we have in the construction sector that has been diagnosed, and it has been as an accumulation of inventory and that it needs to evolve, but with the exception of that, the rest of the economy is growing in a satisfactory manner. So that we are hoping for this to be maintained and to be maintained towards the end of the year based on the dynamics of the private sector. The sum of investment plus private consumption that is growing above 5% will continue growing above 5%. The fiscal adjustment when it comes to public spending and to the push of this fiscal movement, that is what we are seeing, and it's because of a reason that was thoroughly analyzed last year in this important convention, and it's the reduction that we need to have regarding the cost of using capital in Colombia. It is high. Initially, we had to reduce it, not to the level we wanted to, but we're talking of 12 percentage points in average, and that's why we are forecasting what we want to forecast. And the markets have received Colombian data that way. We have the performance curve early this year. And there you can see the movement in the right of the yield curve. And it means that the risk perceptions, interseasonal discounts for investment projects are dropping. And it has been like that throughout the different terms that we are analyzing along the curve. I would like to conclude the first part of my presentation warning about something that Javier mentioned, and that's lack of legal security. At this moment, we are subject to a high legal insecurity because a bill that was passed in the Congress of the Republic, and its discussion was highly documented by the general secretaries of the different legislative chambers, and they were like passed. They had certified that had been the adequate process, but it has been questioned now. And the viability of having that reform is something that has been questioned regarding the financing law. If that doesn't pass, obviously we have to conduct an exercise. So what happens is that these will be the outcomes. First, if this tax regulation is not passed, it is very difficult for people to believe in the next one. If this tax initiative, after the process had been certified, if that doesn't pass, I do not think that people are going to believe in a future tax reform. It's not going to be sustainable. So we simulated a permanent effect on investment flows and on the economic growth. This slide here is measuring two things: the effect on economic growth divided into two components. The effect of the loss of credibility in the institutions that we estimated based on simulation exercise of loss episodes regarding investment degree, with shocks that affect the midterm dynamics in many countries of our region and of other regions. And we arrived at the conclusion that we will have an effect equivalent to an increase of 9 points in country risk and in a permanent matter. Simulating that, we say, okay, there is a permanent effect stemming from that increase in country risk or that loss of investment trust. And the blue side, it's the effect of dismantling the effects of the specific reform, the financing law that we are simulating as if it was not viable from the constitutional standpoint, and to see the effects of that same reform. So it is divided into two components, a permanent component and one that stems from that same reform. So if a creative said, okay, the only thing you have to do is to go to the Congress again with another reform, and we say, yes, well, that's not going to solve the permanent problem, and we will have to study the temporary one. This reform that was passed in December has some important initiatives. Not only the reduction on the cost of the use of capital, but also the value-added tax in those countries with high distribution network, together with that system that has already 9,000 companies in the simple regime. That's informality, as was mentioned by Mr. Javier. So these are the effects therein included, and they will not be passed. So the type of reform is something that needs to be thoroughly studied in order to see which part of that blue area could be recovered and which cannot be recovered. The red part are the permanent effects. The external sector, I think that the topic here are the winds that blow against us. This has made us review downwards the growth rates. Here you see families of 3 columns. The bottom line there is that if it's more towards the right, it's a recent forecast, and they become more pessimist to different areas of the world. Here in Colombia, within that adverse one, we have a deterioration in the balance of payment. and the size of our current account is 1 point more than what we had in 2017, when we went from 3.3 to around 4.3 this year. That increase triggers the alarms, and people assumes that the deficit in current account is money that we are lending from the rest of the world. When the rest of the world says, well, we are not going to lend more, we will need to reduce our spending with some recessive effects that we've had. We've seen that in Colombia and also in Latin America. It's session 7 of the film. In Colombia, we had one in the late 90s, and I would like to remind you what happened. In 1997, we had a current account deficit of around 4 points of GDP, and in 1999 we had a surplus. So the rest of the world stopped lending to us, and they started asking for us to transfer resources. So that's in 1999. That night, that was the size of the adjustment, from -4 to -2. So it's an adjustment of 6 points of GDP. The public sector didn't make any adjustments, so it was the private sector that made the adjustment, and the size was 10 points of GDP. That was the worst recession since the 30s. However, there is a difference that strikes us, and it's that the deficit in current account was a trade deficit. In other words, it was an export-import deficit, and that's the blue line you see there. The red line is the factorial part. What foreign investment, whether in fixed income or in capital, have as dividends or as payment of interest to repatriate, and that is the red part. The red part in late 90s was quite stable. The one that went through an adjustment was the blue part on current account. The factorial part didn't have that behavior. Here we have, for example, foreign direct investment has been huge lately. The increase of the participation of foreigners in fixed income in test market is 25% of all the investment, while we had 0 in during that period. So the factorial income it has a quite effect here, and this has to do with difficulties in the balance of trade, and that's something that you can see on this graph. If we move from the left-hand side to the right-hand side, we move in time, and we have like a reddish rectangle, and that is what happens when there is a crisis in the balance of trade. That happens, for example, in year T, a year before there was a deficit in current account. So that's the blue line, which is in the bottom part, and the light blue one is current account, or the part of the current account that has to do with the trade balance. The factorial revenue is the green line. This slide shows the different crises, and it shows the transfers of Colombians in the rest of the world. So these are the 2 horizontal lines you see there, and all the adjustment is in the other part that has to do with the current account. So the conclusion is, yes, the current account has increased. The way the current account is behaving is not the same way that we anticipate in a crisis. In the payment is very different from what we saw in the 90s. The deficit in current account has in its trade component a clear explanation. We are importing a lot of machinery and equipment. These imports have increased in 10%, while the international economy is stagnant, and our exports, which is represented by the red line, and the blue one is world imports. So we see what's happening with international trade, and international trade today is subjected to a very strong slowdown, very different from the case in the 50 years prior to the 2008 crisis. As to its financing, Foreign direct investment has quite a dynamic. It is more stable than any other type of investment, and foreign direct investment in Colombia is significant with respect to GDP if one compares it with the other countries of the region. So the message is the deficit of the current account has increased. Its composition and its financing are very different from what's common in episodes of where you anticipate crisis in the current account, and there is a slowdown of international trade with a drop in international investment, which is of around 6% this year. And that's the logic that we must use to analyze these figures.
Now, the fiscal part, I would like to show you what the results that we have up to the last data observed, the deficit, fiscal deficit measured by the government. We have a deficit of, in July, all those lines is a year. Then we do the sequence year per year. We've had 3 similar years. This year's is different. And on the right hand, we have the primary accounts. So it's net payments of interest. So with this moment, we have a surplus, primary surplus of 1.1% of the GDP that is growing, and it's perfectly consistent with the objective that we have of having of 0.6 GDP of surplus. This is due to the stronger exercise of tax income, and we have an ambitious objective, very highly criticized as optimistic by many people, but at this moment we are surplusing the objective we proposed in 2 billion, 0.2 of the GDP. Recently we closed the normalization asset chapter, and it has a superior results to what we expected. And even considering the problem of the legal stability, where many people would like to have their capital stabilized, but many said that they didn't know what the legal aspect was. That is due to the instability in the legal aspect that may be cost us. But this is going very well, while the expenditures are on line as expected, more or less increasing the investment compared to last year and reducing the expenditures of functioning in an amount that is similar. With a higher collection tax, we're going to meet the fiscal objectives, and we're going to keep on in that midterm without a doubt. I would like to end with 2 fronts where we are working, and it's 2 initiatives that we've been working with the government. One is the results that the mission gave us of the capital market. That's a mission that gave us 64 recommendations to improve the functioning of our capital market, to be able to have more private initiatives in the market capital, that not only good ideas are not being financed. This is the objective of this mission, and the recommendations are aligned with this. And the second is what we call an integral reform of protection towards the elderly people. It's coverage in the pension from the point of view to improve the distribution of the subsidiaries and the contribution regime, to do very important adaptation. So we have to keep on talking about the market capital. We have 2 topics. When are we going to deliver? Before July 2020. July 2020 will be our objective. We hope to have that before time, but these are the 2 fronts. The adjustments recommended that you all know on the investment regime, basic philosophy is to the limits, among others, and to convert those huge reserves that Dr. Javier showed us in tools to be able to be consistent with the growth here in our country as substantial players in the capital market, and to broaden so we can invest the reserves. These are the recommendations given, and we are working on that, and to improve the corporate governance over the second front in which we're working is the Commission to the Integral Reform of the older people. Like Dr. Javier mentioned, that this recommendation given in the mission of capital market, other experts and people in the government is the source of the Commission for the AFPs in the cost of the provisional security. There is a fixed rate on a flow and the better practices, and that we are seeing to try to have a concrete proposal, the separation of the use and the change of base. Since it's used in many countries, the assets under supervision, and to use a clear separation and rational among the financial sources. Second, in the Vitalis rents, I think Dr. Naranjo mentioned it better, there are risks that are not assurable, derived from different ways of seeing the environment, the legal environment, and we have concluded that it's the state that it's the state that originates these risks. It has to be the state to be like a reassurance of those risks. We have proposals, concrete proposals, such as to do substitution in pensions in the specific case of some coverages for incapacities or survival. There is some calculus and there are reserves for this, and we would like to have a connotation of those assets to translating those assets to that they are covered not only by the patrimonies of the private sector, but also from the contributors. The provisional security and vitality rents once solve the problem that we don't have to assure many risks, and we have to have the solution. Here comes the question, how to have more competence. Dr. Javier also mentioned that in the market. And the solution to this is that there are many schemes we are studying, but the third point is in which we want to do a proposal. When would we take this to Congress? Maybe after the elections, in November, more or less. We don't want this to go inside the discussion. Finally, the conclusion would be 7 points that I would like to do. The economy is bouncing reasonably. This result is associated to the investment, private consumption, that we believe it's growing, and it's still recovering. The external context is very difficult. It will continue to be difficult, but we are handling this in a very good way. The current account has been deteriorated, but this is a combination of circumstances. It's not, nothing has to do with the crisis of balance payments. And on the other hand, it has a counterpart. With investment direct investment, it's explained in its commercial part as a very strong increase of goods and capital and stagnation in international trade. The composition, the fiscal dynamic is going well. We would like it to improve. We would like to have more money, but we have a primary surplus observed at the mid-year is consistent. What we want to see at the end of the year, and maybe we're going to surplus these objectives, and we are heading that way. And the type of reform that we're focusing, we are very happy. We've been in discussions with the sector, and hopefully, as Dr. Javier mentioned, we keep on doing these discussions that have been very positive faced with those 2 initiatives in the law. Thank you very much for your attention.